Christian.
All right. Thank you, Arrow, for some music to get us in the mood. So we are going to go ahead and get started. This is Lessons from an Anti-Racism Book Club. And the first thing we are going to start with is what we call a check-in question, which is, the question is, what has your attention today? And this is an element of an agenda on the fly format that we used within the book club to get our audience more engaged and focused on the topic of the meeting. We did these book clubs during work, and like a lot of people, I'm sure, on the call, we're often going from meeting to meeting or from work topic to meeting. And so the idea is to give everybody a second to kind of pause and refocus so people are really present for the meeting at hand. With for our book club, obviously it was that, and for this, to talk about the book club. So people want to put into chat what has your attention today. That would be great. And then we will go ahead and get started with our introductions, and we'll review some of the things people put in chat as to what has their attention after we have all introduced ourselves.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Errol Royston. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm a graphic designer at the Boeing company, and I am the vice president of the Boeing Employee Pride Alliance, ERG, and I am a member of the Racial Equity Task Force at the Boeing company, and I am also the president of the Global Sales and Marketing Diversity and Inclusion Council.
Hi all, my name is Marcy Cahill, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Global Sales and Marketing Lead for P-8A and C-40A Aircraft Sustainment, and I'm also the Vice President of the Global Sales and Marketing Diversity and Inclusion Council.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christian Shepard. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I am a senior data analyst with Launch Consulting, and the chair of my company's Diversity Steering Committee. I was previously a small business liaison officer at Boeing and co-chair of the Puget Sound chapter of the Boeing Employee Pride Alliance, BRG.
Hey y'all, I am Claire Botafarano. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a portfolio manager for Boeing's early career programs, and I'm a recent graduate of one of those programs, the HR Career Foundation program, where I was a founding member of our inclusion committee. And we are so excited to be joining you today. So let's see what has everyone's attention. I see allyship, Roxanne Gay. I mean, how could you not have that on your mind? Challenging myself, planning, going away this weekend, my son getting into college, the balloon fiesta, hiring, staffing, vaccine mandates, that's a lot. Intersectionality, all the space between surviving and thriving. Thank you so much for sharing what has your attention today. You know, we had so many things, around Out and Equal, this conference, but also, all the personal things that y'all are doing. Thank you for sharing that with us. And, we loved, connecting with our audiences during our book club. And the more that we were able to share about our personal lives, we really felt that those connections got much deeper. So thanks again, everyone, for giving us your attention for the next hour. I will now pass it over to Arrow to review our agenda with you.
All right. Thanks, Claire, for that. Today's discussion will include an overview of an employee-led book club that started with the reading of the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and then evolved into the reading of another book called Caste by Isabel Wickerson. We will provide tips for facilitation for your own book club within your networks, and then allow you to also ask us questions about our processes. So, one of the most amazing things about Out and Equal is that it truly brings people together, and even within our own company. So in 2019, I met individuals that worked at my company, but basically lived on the other side of the country. Those introductions evolved into like great friendships, lasting friendships. And although we have different backgrounds, there was this fictive kinship developed, and we maintain those connections till now. So in 2020, the murder of George Floyd became a watershed moment for the Boeing company, as our top level leaders moved the company to take action from an anti-racist standpoint. There was also a lot of pushback from the employee body. It It was my newfound network who had become close friends of mine who recognized some biases that they had and decided to educate themselves and create a book club to read White Fragility to help others understand that anti-racism does not mean anti-whiteness. Through the notice of pushback for these conversations, we noticed that there was a true need for education and conversation around this topic. As a champion of diversity, I was brought in to be a facilitator and aid in conflict mediation, and to also provide another diverse perspective to the group.
So as Arrow mentioned, the societal focus on racial issues after the George Floyd murder brought about a significant amount of pushback from some Boeing employees, most of which was seen via an internal social media tool that Boeing has. And as a passionate advocate of DE&I, I personally became really involved in those conversations and made a very deliberate effort to try and share educational materials about institutional racism and white supremacy and topics like that as much as possible to help get people more informed and educated. And as a result of my involvement with that, Rory, who is one of the people that Arrow had met at Out and Equal and was one of the people who got the book club started, reached out to me and invited me to join the book club as a facilitator. Like myself, Rory is a white ally who felt it was really important that we step up and create a space for white people to educate ourselves and other white allies in an effort to lessen the emotional labor that our friends and colleagues of color we're having to expend. And I think that is a concept that I think we're all familiar with. I remember yesterday during the plenary, Aaron touched on that idea of allies needing to step up and help with emotional labor. And I think that is really key when it comes to any sort of allyship. And that's also a huge part of why the first book that we selected was White Fragility, since it really aligned well with the goals and intent of the group in regard to really creating a space for white allies to educate themselves and help educate other white allies. And so to recruit people, what we did is we used the internal social media tool that I had mentioned, where we created a group on that, and we shared information about the book club through that tool with other BRGs, with diversity councils, and within our own networks as well.
And this is where I was introduced to the book club. So like Arrow and Christian, the murder of George Floyd really sparked within me a deep desire to learn more about race and racism in America. I saw the White Fragility book club advertisement come up right as I was feeling this desire to be more educated and more involved. And so I joined the conversations as the book club went through each chapter. And as I learned more from the book and the discussions that we had, I wanted to do more too. So I still wanted to keep learning, but I just had this drive that I needed to do something. So one of the things I had also heard about, and Christian Arrow had talked about, and I love how it's being brought up at this conference in different places, is that emotional labor burden placed on minority groups when it comes to the conversations about race. So in many cases, the expectation is to lead conversations and educate the majority about race. That expectation falls on the minority people. And as a white person, I wanted to help be part of that emotional labor. So both to take the initiative to educate myself and then also be part of the process to educate others. So, and I wanted to do that also in partnership with my friends and colleagues who identify as Black or people of color. And so when I saw that Christian was asking for people who wanted to be more involved in the second book, I wanted to take action, so I volunteered.
Similar to Marcy, I had also attended the White Fragility Book Club and followed that same path into becoming a facilitator for Caste. Now, when we chose this book, it was due to recommendations coming out of our White Fragility Book Club. It was recommended by one of our D&I subject matter experts that we take our understanding of race up to the society level. with White Fragility, we understand racism in ourselves, but what does it mean to look at racism in our nation? How is that carried out? And how does it still function? And most importantly, how do we dismantle it? And now that we've had our book club reading through Caste, we thought, okay, how do we switch our content up? What's next? And we're looking to find different perspectives or different literary styles. We've surveyed our Caste book club for recommendations and are also open to yours as well. So throw them in the chat. A few, though, that we are considering are Change Your World by John Maxwell, We Are Everywhere, Protest, Power, and Pride in the History of Queer Liberation, No Pity, People with Disabilities, Forging a New Civil Rights Movement, among others. So please, again, we are still open to recommendations, so please throw those in. In addition to finding a new book to read, though, we're looking to expand our perspectives, through those new literary styles, or perhaps, stepping away from just education and reading maybe a memoir or about something other than race or in addition to race. But it's more than that. We want to develop more people for facilitation and planning and bringing those people in so that they can grow some of the skills that we have through this process and bring that into their professional and personal lives. It's our responsibility to learn about all aspects of diversity and taking that active role in exploring them, similar to what Marcy was saying. With that, let me hand it over to Christian to talk through our lessons learned and some of our outcomes.
Thanks, Claire. So first up, planning. As I mentioned previously, one of the main tools that we used in the recruiting aspect of planning for the book club was a Boeing internal social media tool. It's a Boeing specific tool, but the functionality of it is very similar to Facebook groups or Yammer or things like that. So it was basically a matter of creating the group and then publishing information to that group about the schedule and the book that was going to be read, which initially was White Fragility, things like that. And we also used the social media tool as a means of spreading the really doing internal promotion to BRGs, diversity councils, our personal networks, also on some of those conversations that had originally been part of what kind of was a spark for a lot of us as well. And so basically just did a lot of recruitment and promotion through internal social media.
We wanted to make sure we stayed on schedule as well and planned out the sessions. We allocated chapters by week, and at the end of each week, every Friday, we would have an internal company meeting. This weekly call was always a good turnout for participation and was one of the highlights of the book club from the first book. So we wanted to keep the rhythm of having that weekly call for the second discussion. We also talked with facilitators and created a plan for how to deal with and execute on conflict resolution.
As you may have noticed in our introduction, we come from different parts of the organization, and that meant our schedules could be incredibly varied and unpredictable. It helped to give our team flexibility where we needed, and so we did a lot of coordination and collaboration asynchronously. We used a team chat application called Mattermost for a few things, asking for and providing feedback on discussion questions, requesting facilitation coverage, or looking to brainstorm for what's next. Marcy and I also used a shared OneNote available to the entire planning team to map out that schedule, identify key passages that resonated and might be worth further discussion, and then drafting and redrafting discussion questions that we weren't able to cover in our weekly meetings.
Yeah, when Claire and I were planning our discussion questions, we used some from the Caste discussion guide that was published on the Oprah Book Club site, but in many cases, the questions didn't wholly align with the chapters we were reading. Instead, they were targeted more toward discussing the book after reading the entire thing versus going chapter by chapter. So this is a major difference between how the White Fragility Book Club operated, which had kind of a guide chapter by chapter already published, versus the Caste book club. So by combining the methods of using some of those preset discussion questions and then also creating some custom questions, we were able to provide a means of more targeted conversations, while also trying to be as efficient as possible. And so what you're seeing right now is kind of an example of the visual tools we also use. So some of us are visual learners, myself included. So we also put together these pictorials that describe how the aspects of the Caste book builds on one another. So for instance, Wilkerson identifies these pillars of Caste, which you saw at the beginning that look like the building. It's what holds up the Caste system in America, and then goes on to identify the tentacles of Caste, which you were probably wondering what on earth the octopus tentacles have to do with this. But the tentacles of Caste are kind of seen about how the Caste system like wraps around all of our systems and the way we interact and do things in America. So we use these visuals to kind of build up our understanding of the Caste book. So next we'll move on to the topic of facilitating. One item that was really important for facilitating was to ensure we provided a safe space for these uncomfortable situations or uncomfortable conversations. And so we used some ground rules that we adapted from what we had used for White Fragility reading guide. And these provide a foundation of basic understanding of race and racism in America. And we ask that the book club members start their conversations from these baselines. And so since the ground rules work for White Fragility, we continue to use them to discuss Caste.
As far as building community, we realized that we have created a process of fostering connections, and that it created like the best learning environment. So this is important because it allows people to feel safe and comfortable opening up to a deeper level of conversation. By getting the audience used to using check-ins and check-outs, participants knew they would have to talk and engage each other. Therefore, they got to learn from each other. And a check-in question could be as simple as, what has your attention today, the one we used, or as deep as you want it to be. We saved the deep answers to the end of our checkout questions. Usually they were, what did you notice and what did you learn? What is amazing about this is that everyone's perspectives were so diverse that it became another level of learning.
As you can imagine, the conversations around Caste could get very uncomfortable, especially with both sides of Caste represented in the virtual room. And so as facilitators, it was very important that we recognize common patterns, especially those among the dominant caste or white people. And these included things like distancing, saying things like society is, people should just, what about all the people who aren't here today who should be? As a facilitator, it was important for us to respond to these, right? You can't let it go on in the community. And so, bringing it back to their own reflection and their own accountability. What part do you see yourself playing? What might you do? How is the most effective way for someone to talk to you about your casteism or your racism? Another very common pattern was dominating the discussion. So the same person speaking first or for a very long time, constantly jumping in, or perhaps speaking several times before others while they're sitting back in silence. And so as a facilitator, trying to prompt the group, who haven't we heard from? Or let's make space for people who need more time if you've already spoken up. Let's wait until everyone has a chance. Or maybe circle around the table for thoughts. Another pattern is positioning themselves as already getting this. So again, the dominant caste saying this, or white people saying this. Well, I already know this, or I came from X place and I can't believe how white it is here. I'm married to have children who are, followed by distancing, right? Rather than insider recognition that that doesn't mean that they're exempt, right? They're not exempt from that behavior, and their learning is not finished. And so responses here is really, again, bringing it back to the content of the book, asking them to reflect on how that may apply to them and how maybe their behavior may or may not have been demonstrating their awareness in practice. There are several others I won't go into detail, but they also include checking out hopelessness, expecting people of color to teach them about race, right? Claiming the discussion might not be applied to them because perhaps they're not from the United States. At least for the books that we were reading, were very based in the United States. So these are patterns to look for as well, and understand how might you respond to it and bring the conversation back to what it really needs to be, and refusing to let people distance themselves from what the conversation needs to be. So within recognizing those patterns, another thing that would happen often is a hush falling among the room, right, or the virtual room. And so understanding some good silence breakers helps address those two common challenges for white people in cross-racial discussions. So first one is the fear of losing face, right? They don't want to make a mistake, or perhaps they're afraid of how they're going to be perceived. Second, the lack of humility that we often have when discussing racism. And I say that as a white person. And so these silence breakers can help engender a stance of curiosity and humility that then counter the certitude that many white people have regarding our racial perspectives. In doing so, they tend to open rather than close discussion and connection. And while we didn't do this with our group, highly recommend sharing some of these silence breakers at the beginning of your book clubs, because this is going to allow and enable people who may not feel comfortable speaking up or don't know how to break the silence in certain ways. So some examples include, I'm really nervous or uncomfortable saying this, but, or and. I just felt something shift in the room. I'm wondering if anyone else did. Calling out the awkwardness can be important. This is what I understand you to be saying. Is that accurate? Or I'm engaged but needing time to process this. What I'm working on processing is XYZ. These silence breakers are very important. And again, we have more examples that we can follow up with as well. So I've reviewed patterns and silence breakers. Let me hand it over to Christian to talk about calling in versus calling out.
Thanks, Claire. So, calling in and calling out, I think this is a topic that a lot of people are familiar with and we've heard about. I know, again, that this is something that was touched on in the plenary by Erin yesterday. And basically, it's just the idea that kind of our starting point as facilitators was to understand that the goal of our book club was to educate people and to get people engaged and thinking critically about our society and the things that we have been taught and all of that. And so recognizing that the best way to get through to people was to approach with gentleness and to try and call people in, right? As if someone was engaging in some of the common patterns that Claire mentioned, like I do remember very much times where we did have those issues where someone was dominating the discussion or was doing the distancing. And so it was just a matter of really finding a way to gently nudge people to call them into the conversation and get them to look at what they were doing and think critically about why they were dominating the conversation or why they were distancing themselves, and really invite them to be more engaged, more emotionally engaged with the material, and really focus on the fact that the whole goal for everyone involved in this book club, facilitators and readers, was the process of learning and growing.
Thanks, Claire and Christian, for all of the wonderful insights on facilitating. Next, wanted to talk about some of the outcomes of the book club. So through the cycle of the White Fragility book club to the Caste book club, we increased engagement, turning participants like myself and Claire into facilitators. And so this is a cycle we're targeting to continue into our next book club. We found facilitation to be an immense learning opportunity, and want to provide that opportunity for other people who are passionate about diversity and inclusion and who want to get more involved.
Yeah, and as Marcy mentioned, and as I have said before, the educational aspect of this book club was just massive, right? It is a huge element of one of the best things that we all were getting. Again, not just for the people reading the book, but for us as facilitators. And so when we were transitioning from reading White Fragility to Caste, and we had some facilitators who had been involved with White Fragility that needed to take a step back, we felt it was really important that we get new people involved by asking participants to volunteer who would want to move into a facilitation role. And it was really critical, I think, to have really, I don't want to say it's change, because I think there is a framework of what was being done and how we were doing it through facilitation, but it's sort of an agile approach. I'm a data guy, I'm an IT type, so I look at everything through agile lens, and it's really the goal of having a sort of agile approach to facilitation where we can have facilitators roll off and roll on, so that as we are transitioning from book to book, we get new perspectives and new experience brought in for the facilitators, which makes the group it makes the book club a much stronger and more robust group.
Yeah, a few things that stood out to me as success was the growth that occurred in the group, from the openness of conversations, from White Fragility, because White Fragility is a book that's about, white people not being able to talk about, whiteness and the privileges of it. And to see a group of people truly let their guards down is amazing. Even me as a minority, I learned from the opposite perspective. It unified us in a way to make us want to learn more. People were not ready for the conversations to end. It inspired others to want to continue and be more involved, which led us to even reading the second book, Caste. And in Caste, we would bring up other systems and compare them to, the US. And it was awesome. We would talk about understanding from our intersectional lived experiences. So much that we even evolved our conversations to at one point discuss pronouns. And by the end of the second book, everybody on the WebEx had their pronouns displayed. And by the end of our conversations, we ended up seeing some of them move and change their pronouns to even be more in the non-binary and comfortable to, share that. And mind you, these are people who are not ERG members. So I think that is what moved me most. And before this group, I had never seen an entire meeting of people with everyone's pronouns displayed. And it was just like, to me, it was like a proud dad moment.
I love that. So one of the outcomes also was a realization and self-examination of internal biases. So for me personally, I learned about how I have unwittingly perpetuated caste system in America, or have defaulted to my own internal biases. For instance, understanding how the question, where are you from, can really perpetuate caste distinctions. And then also learning the truth and the real history about Confederate monuments. So because of that safe space, readers and facilitators were able to talk about their realized biases and lessons learned, and then brainstorm and think about how to move forward. And then on the flip side, I felt other people were able to share their authentic self and were comfortable sharing personal stories with experiencing racism. And so this dialogue shared was a really powerful learning tool, really understanding what different people's lived experiences were.
Oh, sorry, I was talking on mute. And on the subject of experiences, one of the experiences that stayed with me was a woman on one of the calls, said that she caught herself noticing that she does the purse clutch when a Black man walks by her. And then the fact that she was comfortable enough to open up and talk about it within the group, it was, it just showed, the comfortability and how, she made the commitment to be better, and just mind blowing as that there was no judgment because we were all in a learning environment, right? So we're all there learning to deprogram ourselves from what we were programmed to think. And in this group setting, just elevating each other to be comfortable to share those stories.
As a white person and facilitator, it was one thing to read about how the author experienced casteism and racism, but to experience the vulnerability of our Black, Indigenous, people of color members as they shared different ways they'd been impacted was truly humbling, and led to more reflection on my behavior and how I can be a better advocate and ally. It also opened the door for me to share very humbly how I've realized where I was the problem and still am, similar to the story that Arrow mentioned. Vocalizing it aloud is powerful.
Yeah. So moving on to overall education, as far as overall education, what did we learn from the book aside from just the U.S. race relations? For me, as I mentioned earlier, I learned the white perspective, right? Early in the first book, from my perspective, white people everywhere I go, I see them all the time. But, for some white people, they're a part of a majority, depending on where you live, and where you grew up. You could go over half your life not ever having to engage with a minority. And those are results from redlining, right? So when we get things like the Black hair touch and the purse clenching, a lot of times they've never engaged with a Black person before, outside of news and TV. So, and especially in like rural areas. And I've talked to a lot of people, who didn't meet a Black person until college. Now, not that this is an excuse for behavior, it's just a perspective that I never knew. So even as a minority, I learned other perspectives of the majority. And the purpose of this, right? The purpose of learning is to diversify your lens that you look through the world in.
Exactly, Arrow. The book club was also an opportunity to learn the history that we did not learn. I will speak as a person who grew up in Texas. Much of my teaching around the Civil War was a both sides type of situation, many reasons for the start of the war, and slavery was just part of that, right? And so these books, followed by true reflective discussion with the book club, helped me relearn and acknowledge the truth and the harmful impact of not teaching this in school.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Arrow. I think really ultimately the two components of the book club that made it feel really successful to us was the educational component, right? That was a huge part of it, that we were educated as facilitators, our members were educated reading the books, and people really walked away with a lot more knowledge. All of us walked away with a lot more knowledge than we had before it. And I think in addition to the educational component, one of the things that really made it successful was also the variety of our format, as far as we had both, as Claire mentioned, in regard to planning and facilitation, we had asynchronous conversations as facilitators, but we also, through that internal social media tool, had conversations asynchronously with our book club members. So we would put questions up on the social media page every week. And then we would have our weekly conversations about those. And so it was a really great, we really tried, I think, as facilitators to embrace different communication styles, different availability to get people really engaged. And I also think having, done this book club with work versus other book clubs I've done personally, that a big part of the success was also the weekly cadence and kind of the talking about it as we went along, as opposed to circling back and discussing the entire book after having read the entire thing. I think our approach of meeting as we went and discussing individual chapters really helped with that education component, which was such a huge key focus for us, and was why I personally think it felt really successful. And I would say one last thought of successful was also that having that approach of having people coming in and out as needed. I have since we finished Caste, I have actually left the Boeing company. And so which I'm sad about for the book club because it was a fantastic experience, but I think I'm really excited to see who the new facilitators for book 3 are going to be, and to keep in touch with the people that Marcy and Arrow and Claire, and find out how book 3 goes with new facilitators and new perspectives. So I think those were really just some of the biggest components of the book club that made it a real positive experience for everyone. And now we would love to do some Q&A. So questions from the audience. And I know I have seen a whole bunch coming in on the chat. And I think Claire, and Marcy, I saw your face. You're like, wait, no. Claire has been the one keeping an eye on chat. I've seen it streaming. I haven't been able to track what's actually coming through. So Claire, if you want to start with some of the questions we got through chat.
Absolutely. And I saw Marcy, thank you for answering some of them in real time, but we'll want to bring up some of those same questions or themes that we saw for Q&A so all can also hear it. So one bit of housekeeping for us is, will the slides be available after? I think we would love to make those available. I don't know, Arrow, Christian, Marcy, any issues with that? Yeah.
Absolutely
okay, great.
Not. Yeah, let's do it.
Wonderful. Just more green. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this is Kennel Clark. I was just going to jump in. There have been several inquiries, actually lots of inquiries for the deck. So for those of you that did send me an email, I will forward that out directly. In addition, at the close of the session, I will also post this deck to the file section within the Pathable platform. So feel free to access it there as well. Thanks, Claire.
And I just want to really quickly mention, since Canal brought up the file section of the Pathable platform, we have, Marcy also has uploaded to that the reading guide for White Fragility, which we use. It's an official reading guide that we used when we did White Fragility, and also uploaded the guide that primarily Marcy and Claire came up with for Caste that we used. So definitely check out the file section of Pathable for those files as well as the deck.
Thanks, Christian. Wonderful. So let me pose this question to the group, and feel free to jump in, start where you'd like. But just some questions around how large did the book club get? And we did have 2, I think we consider them separate book clubs, although they worked together, but White Fragility, and then Arrow, maybe you could speak to that, and Marcy around Caste. And, how did we function, or how did we have those discussions? Did we have multiple times in which we did it, or how did we facilitate? So can you go into more around the thought process behind it and how large those book clubs got?
That question was a book. That was long. So I'm going to talk about the first book. So for White Fragility, so we started off with discussion questions. So we had a discussion guide, and what we would do was use our internal network to pose the question. And then when posing that question, we would have a poll. And through that poll and that tool, the question that got the most votes was the question that, was posed, that we asked the group for a week. And that would sit on the platform for a week and people could chat about it. And then at the end of the week, we would have the group come together for an hour discussion, WebEx. It was every Friday, kind of around lunchtime, so it's not interfering with people's schedules. And it was just a place to talk. And what we would do is we would use the agenda on the fly method. And so what agenda on the fly is basically we would give 1 minute for everyone to pose a topic. And so we would use an annotation and they would type their topic on the screen. So throughout that, we would go down the list and whoever had their topic, we would ask them what did they need. They would come off mute, explain their topic, and then we would all talk about it. And at the end of that discussion, we would ask the person who posed the topic if they got what they needed, and they would answer yes or no to continue the conversation or close the conversation. Then we would move to the next proposed topic. And that's kind of how we moved forward. And it gave an open discussion for everyone in the room to be able to engage one another. And I think I answered most of that question. It was really, I'll throw it to Marcy.
Yes, and I think for White Fragility being so large, that was the perfect way to function. But I think, Marcy, you can add a little bit more color on what we changed for Caste.
Yeah, so the differences between White Fragility and Caste are quite a lot. So it's a much bigger book, and it's, I think, much more kind of journalistic and academic. So it's just a more robust book, and I think that's why we did it a little bit differently. So we spread it out for quite a long time. We did 15 total weeks, and Claire and I just decided on kind of what the discussion questions would be. We pretty much broke out like one discussion question per section, per chapter of the book, and then would try to post those in advance on our internal social media site. And then that Friday, every Friday, we would have a 1 hour discussion that people could call into, and we just went linearly, through the discussion questions. We also did kind of a recap of each chapter before we talked about the discussions, just because, like I said, it's a lot to read sometimes, and it just reminds people what the chapters went over, and can hopefully spark some of the topics that they wanted to talk about. And sometimes the discussion questions weren't addressed. If people had particularly strong thoughts about something or questions, we would allow conversation for that as well.
Thanks, Arrow. Thanks, Marcy. Another one is around, conducting these sessions virtually, but also how do we make sure that everyone felt like they could have a voice with large, or even, as you were saying, Marcy, a little bit smaller groups. 10 to 15 even still seems like a large discussion group for everyone to be able to be engaged and comfortable. Arrow, I know you talked a little bit more about agenda on the fly, but opening this up to our other panelists to sort of talk through ways in which we were able to keep everyone engaged and make sure that they had a voice.
Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. So as Arrow mentioned, we did use the agenda on the fly. And I would say that really the way we tried to keep people engaged was through the agenda on the fly, because it did give people the opportunity to come to the meeting and just bring up whatever they wanted, as well as using the discussion questions on the social media page, right? It really was an intent of, I think, trying multiple ways, right? Some people are much better with responding to a question online. Some people are much better with showing up to a meeting and having a conversation live. So it really was a goal of trying to give people different ways of getting engaged and whatever worked better for them. And even with Caste, as Marcy mentioned, we didn't have the agenda on the fly format, but we still would open it up for whatever questions people wanted to discuss. And so to me, I think really a key part of it was sort of that loose framework, right? Where there were discussion questions. There was both online and planned for the weekly meeting. And we had that as a framework, but we also were not so attached to it that if there was something else that people wanted to discuss that we hadn't thought of, that we, had any problem kind of adjusting and refocusing the attention of the meeting.
I'd like to also add on to that because there were times where we had a light crowd and we kind of drifted to stay like still on the topic of race education. But at one time we had a leader at our group who had done a TED talk, and we played her TED talk, and it was about redlining and living in lucky zip codes. And we had a robust discussion, of that episode. And that's how we left it open enough to where we got on discussions of pronouns, and we got on discussions of why other people go through other things, and people will also talk about their lived experiences. So that was one thing that we did different with the Caste book, is to just leave it that open for that kind of openness if someone wants to share even a YouTube video.
Thanks, Arrow. Thanks, Christian. All right. One question around recruitment and participation. Any tips for driving participation? Our group is still so small. Arrow, Christian, Marcy, let's talk about things that maybe we did already, and also things that we think we might change for the next book club to pull in more participants.
Yeah, so I think utilizing your networks is really important, and combining the networks with like over communication and advanced advertising, for lack of a better word. So for instance, Arrow and I are members, we're leaders of the Global Sales and Marketing Diversity and Inclusion Council. And then I'm also an alumni of a different rotation group. Claire is an alumna from a different rotation group. So just trying to like utilize those networks that we all have and spread the word about what's coming up and why it should happen. And then communicating in advance. So Arrow had made a flyer. He's a graphic artist and is amazing with that sort of stuff. And so we were able to use that, send it through email, post it on different groups in the internal social media and things like that. Arrow, did you want to comment more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't explain how it is, leveraging your networks. So that's number one, right? Because once you forward it to someone who's going to forward it to someone, I think a lot of the expansion of our network was just piquing the curiosity of people. And there's like this diverse, so there's this group at Boeing, it's called the Boeing Experience. It's on one of our internal Facebook channels. It's a huge group. So like anytime you post something there, it's going to go throughout the company. So just knowing like where those conversation points are in your company, like if you have a news broadcasting system, like we have Boeing News now, you can put it in things like those or manager news. And actually one thing that we have now is at Boeing is our leaders are getting more involved. They have to be involved. It's something that the whole company is pushing forward. So just forwarding it to your leaders, because this should be something that they want to pursue as well. So get it to leadership and push it out even broader. Over.
Yeah, and one final thought on that, because definitely as we've mentioned, there were some sessions where we had smaller groups than others. And I think that the other thing to keep in mind is that when that does happen, it doesn't mean you're not still making a difference, right? That sometimes in those smaller meetings, even when there were only like 5 of us on the call, we had really amazing conversations, and those conversations impacted people in a positive way. And that in and of itself is a way to help expand, right? Because if you do have a time where you go through a slump in engagement, if you will, the people who are still engaged are still getting something really meaningful out of that experience. And so they're going to go back to their networks and share with their friends and their coworkers about those experiences. And so those, yes, definitely, you know, I think I saw some people in chat talking about how there was more energy last year. And I think we also saw that initially we had a lot of energy that did not sustain that level indefinitely. But it was the people who were engaged were really engaged and really were getting a lot out of it, and were sharing, you know, and not just sharing insofar as trying to bring people into the book club, but taking what they learned and experienced in the book club to their friends, to their family, to their coworkers, talking about these things they were learning and experiencing, and just really sharing that knowledge.
Yeah, I know Arrow mentioned this in the presentation, but one of the things I thought was really exciting was, you know, Arrow and I and Claire maybe had our pronouns in our names, and someone asked about why you do that. And so Arrow had the opportunity to explain about pronouns. And we had one person in our group that was already using she, they pronouns. And then during the course of the book club, we had one person actually change their pronouns from he to they, because they decided they felt comfortable with our group to talk about how they feel more comfortable using they. And we're able to do that in our group. So I thought that was really amazing. So you are affecting people's lives, even if you don't have 200 people on the call.
Thanks all. I tried to gather and put together as many similar questions as I thought. I know I didn't get to them all, and so I do want to open up the floor for maybe one or two people to come off mute and ask a question, whether I missed it or perhaps you thought of something based on our discussion.
Don't be shy.
Hi, I'll go. So what can we do to learn from you as facilitators? Because I think that is one of the key magic points that you had when facilitating these sessions and growing the engagement. I feel like a lot was done thanks to you guys being great facilitators.
I would say the biggest thing for me is just listening, letting people get comfortable with talking. Like Claire said in the chat, being okay to sit with the silence for a while. I think silence makes people uncomfortable, especially on WebEx meetings and Zoom meetings. Sitting with that silence, let people gather their thoughts, and don't be afraid to be the first person to speak.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think listening is a huge part of it. And just, you know, being willing to, it's listening, and it's also being willing to be vulnerable and share your own experiences. And, you know, we had a really great cross section of people sharing experience. Arrow was able to talk about his experience as a person of color. Claire was able to talk about, you know, what it was like growing up in Texas, which, yowzer. Anyway, but I mean, I think it's really, you know, understanding that you don't have to be an expert to be a facilitator, right? You can just be guiding the conversation and helping people learn and grow. And it's not that you necessarily have to be, you know, a subject matter expert. It's really just being open to listening, to learning, and to helping other people learn.
Yeah, and for just some kind of training, I think somebody asked about facilitator training. We don't have any formal training just for this. I think some of us have probably been through emotional intelligence courses and things like that. But the White Fragility guide that's uploaded in the files actually has a whole section about tips for facilitating that I think Claire used for some of the points that she talked about. And I think they are very valid. So I recommend reading through those and practicing those things. Have somebody role play with you and have somebody try to do one of those behaviors and you practice with how you respond to that. And I think the more times you're able to get that language and rhythm about how to respond and how to redirect and how to kind of acknowledge viewpoints, but then also maybe let other people talk and input too. I think that that's a good thing to try. So take a look at that guide.
Yeah, and I will add one last thing and then hand it over to Christian to close. For me, it's about, as a facilitator, sometimes we can get very passionate, right? We're doing this because we're excited about what we're doing and we care about what we're doing. And I will say a lot, it was important for me to admit when I made a mistake or was wrong and apologize for it. So I remember I made a very broad generalization about a certain population, a religious population, and had to walk that back and say, you're right, I'm sorry, and thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right. I hear that a lot I listen to Brene Brown quite a bit, and so that's the thing too, is we're not the experts, and we're constantly works in progress because we have to deprogram a lot of things, and we have to realize there are a lot of perspectives out there. So that is what I will add. Christian, over to you to take us through our closing.
All right. So we are going to do, like our starting question, we wanted to wrap this up the same way we wrapped up our book club with our checkout question, which the one that we always used for book club is, what did you notice or what did you learn? So definitely would love for folks to share in chat what they noticed, what they learned. Also, if people want to come off mute and share something they noticed or learned in this session, please absolutely feel free to do so. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And really, really grateful for all of you being here and asking such great questions.
I have a comment of something I've noticed or learned. I thought, because in my colleagues outside of my work situation, we're the only ones running like a book club that's, EBRG based or ERG based. And I thought I was like super unique and in this own little tunnel by myself, and we were the only ones doing it. And now like Boeing does it, which is really awesome. My background's in aerospace, so I was like, oh my God, these are my people. So yeah, so it's really cool that it's not just me and I'm not like alone. Because I was like at my own little island, like, this is important. Why is no one attending? So it's good. Thank you for everything.
That's awesome. Keep on keeping on.
Anyone else want to come off mute?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, so I'd like to just make a comment, just an overall comment. The one thing I've noticed is that these book clubs, it brings a sense of awareness on a broader scale, but also on a micro scale, meaning self-awareness. And I think that if we are striving toward being authentic, the self-awareness part becomes so prominent, and people begin to kind of pick up the little hints like, oh, I clutch my purse, or, when I think of this, or I hear this, this is my reaction. And I feel that books do play a part in bringing those emotions, those realities, feelings, and all of that. It plays a part in bringing those things alive for an individual if they're at the stage of willingness to admit it and to kind of formulate their authenticity in this environment, which carries over obviously in the rest of our lives. I think that is how we begin the cultural change, right? It starts from within. And so what I've noticed and what I've learned is that it's the willingness of each of us to feel free enough to say, you know what? Yeah, I'm one of those people that when I hear this, it triggers this, or when I hear that, or I'm a person that I don't understand like what this means because I didn't grow up with, minorities, or I didn't grow up in this environment, but I'm not saying I don't want to know. I want you to help me to know. And I think when people take that strive and that step, it makes such a difference. And within my company, I've seen that a lot. I work for Fitch, the Fitch Group, and I've seen that a lot, and it's been happening. And it really inhibits and it nurtures like the cultural change that happens. And so books are very important. And I think more books that are crying out toward the level of this book, Caste, this book made me really angry, is a good thing. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, guys.
Totally, I agree with
Thank you.
everything. Like, yeah,
Thank you.
I was just nodding my head like crazy through everything you said, Andrea. I think that's yes, just yes.
Thank you.
All right, so I believe we are at time. So Christian, if you could stop recording. I don't know how you all feel, but I think